Earlier this month, President Cyril Ramaphosa declared the 29th of May 2024 as the date for South Africa's general elections. Many observers say the elections are likely to be the most hotly contested since the ushering in of the democratic dispensation 30 years ago. Good evening, welcome to Unfiltered. I'm Sizwe Mpofu Walsh. This week, the Electoral Commission published the elections timetable, resulting in the closing of the voters' roll. No further voter registration may take place, either at a local office or online. The Electoral Commission says it's all systems go for the elections and candidates are urged to collect signatures before the deadline. To help us unpack the topic is Commissioner at the Independent Electoral Commission, Janet Love, who joins me in studio, and Policy Analyst at Election Monitoring Network, Dr. Nkosikhulule Nyembezi. Before we continue with the discussion, let's take a look at what Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana said regarding IEC funding during the recent budget speech.
To ensure the effective discharge of office duties during elections and its other responsibility beyond the polls, the Independent Electoral Commission is allocated 2.3 billion. The police and the defense purely for the elections. The police and the defense purely for the elections are allocated an additional 350 million to support the elections. A further 200 million will be allocated for political party funding as political parties prepare for the general elections.
Commissioner Janet Love, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
How ready is the IEC for this all-important election, which is now 3 months away exactly?
We're ready. We had to be ready by the first possible date, which was the 22nd, but we're ready for the proclaimed date of the 29th of May. And it's, as you say, all systems go.
And what about that date? Are you glad that it was an earlier date? We had the Chief Electoral Officer earlier and he suggested that the IEC was ready and prepared for an early date. Do you welcome the date and the fact that it wasn't pushed to later, which it legally could have been?
Look, we generally speaking prepare ourselves for all the options, which means we have to be ready right at the outset, at the beginning. So I think from that perspective, we didn't have our a sort of particular angle on which date we would prefer. But obviously, in our consultations with the President and with the Premiers, we engaged on what kinds of options and dates there were. We were able to present our readiness program. And also, I think we were able to engage on what some of the advantages and disadvantages, weather being one, just generally. But of course, none of that's entirely predictable, so we have to be ready whenever.
Absolutely. Dr. Nyembezi, welcome back to Unfiltered. Just your thoughts since we now have you on the date that we now have, and whether you think that this is a good and a wise thing for South Africa, having this election earlier in the window than later.
Yes, thank you very much, and good evening to both of you. Yes, it's a good thing. It brings certainty into our political system. Certainty that...
Oh no.
Sure, we've just lost you for a second there, Dr. Nyembezi. We will make sure we try to reconnect you and get you back. But Commissioner Janet Love, you know, one of the big controversies at the moment, maybe that's too strong a word, but is this question of this requirement of electoral signatures for parties and for candidates. And I think that that's as a result of the Amendment Act, if I'm not mistaken.
It is, yes.
You know, to what extent do you think that this requirement is unduly onerous, and what do you make of the charge that you know the requirement for this many signatures is too much to expect for new entrants?
I think there are a lot of different ways of looking at it, and first of all I think that we need to remind ourselves that this was something that was being debated quite vigorously, as well as having a lot of public input from around March last year up until the day the actual Amendment Act was proclaimed. And since then it's also seen further public debate. I think it's wrong for anybody to presume that an application to court, even made at the late stage of January, would necessarily go a particular way. So from our perspective, we had assumed that people would know that the law that was passed in Parliament was the prevailing law until such time as any court was going to make a different decision, and so would prepare accordingly. As to whether or not, I mean, it's onerous. When we made presentations to Parliament, we were asked to present a methodology of looking at how people could indicate levels of people who are from political parties not represented, and at that time it was also independent candidates who could reflect a level of support that would be measured against an objective benchmark. And so the suggestion was that it would be what was the quota in the 2019 elections for a seat in that relevant legislature. And we were asked to give sort of different percentages of that quota. And so Parliament actually started looking at percentages, you know, from 50% right through to 15%. And so I think that the decision by Parliament to look at it from the lower percentage was in order to presumably be more realistic about what would be reasonable for an unrepresented party that had not yet achieved such a quota to be able to present.
But before I go back to Dr. Nyembezi, just in practical terms, what does it mean? Because the quota thing is quite complicated. It's 15% of whatever it was for a particular province. Is the figure of around 100,000 signatures accurate, that a new party would need to contest all the provinces?
Well, at the moment, first of all, if a political party wanted to contest all the provinces, they would need to ensure that, they could do that in obviously just contesting one province, and then they would be both on the provincial and potentially on the national ballot. But if they wanted also to contest in each of the regions, it would be the aggregation of all of those numbers, which could land up to being as not quite as many as that, but not far from it. But I think, again, if that political party were to contest in all the provinces, the number of supporters that they would have to get would be far greater than that. It would be, sort of 85% greater. So I think, those that already have seats in the legislature have demonstrated that they have whatever that number was in the last elections, and to the extent that they retain that support or they don't retain that support, they have at least identified a level of support.
Right. Let me put that to Dr. Nyembezi, and we still have a long show ahead of us tonight. So Dr. Nyembezi, before you left, we were talking about the date, but we've of course now moved on to this controversy around the signatures requirement. What do you make of it? If it's somewhere around 100,000 or maybe below that, somewhere around that figure, do you think that that's unduly onerous, or do you think that in actual fact it's difficult to run an election and you need to get votes and that's hard anyway, and maybe we should have these higher barriers to entry?
I think the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. We had major amendments to the Electoral Act, and some of what is put there, it needs to be put to test for the first time. And so we will see if it works or if it doesn't work. And with the result we will of that lived experience, we will be able to say, let us amend again the law after these elections so as to align the reality with what is in the legislation. So it's not easy to say whether it's onerous or not. But I think the good thing is that everybody knew in advance at the time that the legislation and the regulations were passed that this is the number of signatures that will be required. And they have had time to prepare according to what was stipulated. And so anything else in terms of dealing with the reality might have to be dealt with after the election.
I suppose the counter-argument, Commissioner Janet Love, is that if you set the barriers very high, then you'll ultimately get less contestants, and then there'll be less choice for the electorate. I think it was, about 40,000 votes that you needed for a seat. I may be off there. Whereas if you need 100,000 signatures, that's even more than one seat. So maybe we should have set it at a seat.
Well, again, as I've said, first of all...
And I appreciate you didn't draft the legislation.
I did try and sort of indicate to you is that if a political party felt that the obstacle of being in every single province was just going to take them a little bit too high, and to make the comparator that at least if they could get one seat in the National Assembly, the reality is that if they got that seat by achieving enough support from being part of what the regional to national ballot or provincial, that segment, the provincial to regional to national ballot, the numbers in a place like Gauteng would be around 45,000. And so that would mean that the number of signatures just to qualify for that ballot would be something around the region of about 13,000. I don't have the exact figures in my head, but I can probably dig them out of this file.
No, it's a useful ballpark.
But I mean, but the point about that, I think, is that in a way, every contestant, whether an independent candidate, a represented or an unrepresented party, has to have a strategy for an electoral process. And part of that strategy, I suppose, is to see to the extent to which they can position themselves in the best way possible to win the support, not only through, hopefully, the actual mobilization of people through good policies, but also through things like where are they going to get most of the signatures, where are they going to spend most of their time and most of their effort in terms of political party ads and so on. So that's part of the strategy, I think, that they would have to think about.
Right, let's go to a break. We're discussing the freedom and fairness of South Africa's elections and indeed the preparations, as we're just about 3 months away now from that all-important May 29th date. We'll be back after this to talk about the structure of ballots and voting day, counting, all after the break. Stick with us.
The proclamation of the election date has certain legal consequences for the electoral process. The first major implication is that the voter's roll has now closed. This means no further voter registration may take place either at the local office of the IEC or on the online portal. Voter verifications as well as other validations are currently underway to ensure that there is compliance with the provisions of the law as they relate to eligibility to vote.
We're discussing the election, preparedness for the election on the part of the IEC, as well as the freedom and fairness of this all-important election on the 29th of May. Dr. Nyembezi, could we start with you in this segment? And you know, this is an interesting election from so many different perspectives, and a new election. We're marking 30 years of democracy, for one thing. A lot of people are very interested in the outcome of this election because it hangs in the balance in a way that maybe other elections haven't. But also we've got all these changes to the electoral system at the same time. And I wonder what you think, what you're looking out for in these 3 months, given the changes to our system and your legal understanding of them, what are you looking out for in this election in the 3 months to follow?
Thank you very much. We're looking for something that is going to activate and appetize voters to go out and vote in large numbers. It started with the campaign to encourage voters to go out and register. And we have seen the positive response of South Africans adding their names onto the voters' roll, amending their details in terms of addresses and the sort. So now that we have got a good-looking voters' roll, we want the spotlight to go to the political parties, the candidates, and the voters, so that we can have an interaction based on the election promises that the candidates are going to put forward, for voters to be able to sift and see who can they trust and put the X next to. What will be the downside that we don't want to see is something that discourages voters from going out to go and vote, such that they can say, I don't have anybody I can identify with. So you don't want something like that contradicts the Electoral Code of Conduct, inflammatory speeches, defamation, and even what they call fake news. So we just hope that South Africans will be appetized, then they look at the promises and they go out and vote in large numbers.
Janet Love, the announcement of the timetable wasn't, as is common, met with universal appreciation on the part of political parties. I believe there were 10 or so parties who have written a letter to the IEC. Can you give us more insight on that process? Have you met with those parties, and have those interactions happened yet?
Look, there have been some of the political parties that you've mentioned are represented political parties, and they were part of the consultation that took place before the election timetable was finalized and then proclaimed. So certainly yes, with those political parties. That doesn't preclude further meetings which will happen over time. There were a number of political parties that are unrepresented political parties. There have been different interactions with those political parties, not specifically about some of the issues that they're raising now, but most of those issues, as we understand them, and we are understanding them only, through some of the statements that have been reflected in media, different forms of media, it appears that some of the concern is around the length of time that they have to submit their final candidate nomination lists and comply with the other documentary requirements, including signatures.
Right, and that's around March, is it, for the?
It's
for
on
the
the 8th of March. That is the deadline. And it's the deadline for a number of reasons, but not least of which is because there are certain things that will affect the participation of voters, that are contingent on ensuring that we have a possibility for people to know who the candidates are. And as Dr. Nyembezi was saying, that they then have a possibility to know what those candidates represent, because at the end of the day, that's surely going to be the really critical thing for voters, to know what it is they're voting for. And so I would imagine that that kind of engagement is going to need time. And so that's not least, that's certainly one of the issues.
Can I stick with you on this and then ask for Dr. Nyembezi's response to it as well? One of the things that seems to be new about this election is when we go into that voting booth, the kind of ballot paper we're going to be presented with, or ballot papers, shall we say. Can you talk us through I know that there are different scenarios and we actually don't know exactly what they'll look like yet, because it depends on what you were just talking about. But what are the scenarios for ballot papers and the 3 rather than the 2 that we'll be presented with?
So, as you rightly say, the first really important thing for people to know is that unlike previous national and provincial elections where there were 2 ballots, on this occasion there are 3 ballots, and the reason is because on the provincial ballot for electing a provincial legislature remains a single ballot.
Right.
But for the purposes of the National Assembly, there are now 2 ballots. One of them is a ballot that is to enable a regional voice, and by regional, the regions are defined at the moment as provinces, and so the regional or provincial voice can be heard, and in that sense both political parties and independent candidates can contest on different regional or provincial to national ballots.
Right.
And so there is going to be in all likelihood quite a lot of variation. One province might have a different number of both political parties as well as independent candidates. So for that reason we have 9 regional to national ballots, and then what is called the compensatory set of seats, which is 200 seats in the National Assembly, is made up of political parties in order to enable us to restore, in accordance with the Constitution, as much proportionality as possible. So those 200 seats are only going to be contested by political parties, and each province will have those compensatory seats. So if, for example, you only had what is known as compensatory seats, you could have a situation where some provinces wouldn't even have a representative in the National Assembly,
right,
which is why you need the provincial voice. But of course, you can't also have a situation where provinces that have a much smaller population than other provinces, somehow there is an imbalance that you never have an opportunity to rectify. And that's what's meant by the compensatory system. And it is a requirement of the Constitution. So there'll be, from that point of view, people will get their provincial legislature ballot, and they will get 2 ballots for the National Assembly. The one ballot will be distinct, in other words, for each province. It will have a different ballot, and the one ballot will be for all the provinces. So there'll be 3 ballots that people will need to vote in.
I don't envy you at the IEC for this election. Dr. Nyembezi, this is a really important change in what that experience in the voting booth will be like, and it's been really clearly explained to us. You know, what are your thoughts on what this means to be presented with these 3 ballots for this election?
Oh, I think it's an exciting thing. In fact, it's an exciting thing in that it will be a culmination of the road to the ballot booth. So because these candidates that will be on the ballot paper are likely to bring important issues during election campaigns. Some of the issues that might have been overlooked by political parties that are using a central system in putting together their election manifestos. So to the extent that there will be new voices that bring those new issues, it should make the elections interesting, because election candidates, particularly the independent candidates now, they will have a unique position in that they will be broadcasted on the media, and they will speak in a voice that is even much more authoritative than that of a wise protester, in the sense that they are prospective legislatures. So I hope that indeed by the time people go to vote, they would have heard those issues in the election campaigns, diversity of issues, and then be confident as to who to vote for.
And what do you think?
Who not to vote for, to add, and who not to vote for.
Indeed, indeed. And what do you make of the introduction of independent candidates now on this new ballot, and how that will either enhance or detract from the choice that is open to South Africans in that ballot booth?
It is a positive thing, the introduction of independent candidates to contest alongside political parties. Because Section 19 of the Constitution says every citizen of South Africa has a right to make political choices, including the choice to contest and campaign for a political cause. Political parties have always been a vehicle to enable citizens to enjoy this right to vote and the right to stand for public office, which belongs primarily to the citizens with a barcoded ID, those who are registered in the voters' roll, and so on. So it's going to be very interesting also because it is one way that is taking us forward in a number of ways, because I believe these elections will be different to other elections going forward, because there will be a lot of lessons that we learn that will make us, allow us to refine the system going forward. Particularly also on the issue of how the legislatures are going to look like. So now it looks like it's going to be indeed unique 9 elections, in the sense that we have 9 provinces. And hopefully those provinces will behave in a unique way that serves the people in that area, as opposed to go under a blanket form that is dominated by one political party at a national level in the way that policies and legislations are implemented. So there's a lot to look for in the road to elections and post-elections in terms of how these legislatures are going to behave.
Indeed, we are discussing the freedom and fairness of South Africa's upcoming election on the 29th of May, and also discussing the readiness and preparedness for that election. Stick with us. When we come back, we'll look at some deeper questions of law and policy.
The election timetable is the motive force in the intensive preparations for the delivery of the 2024 general elections. The timetable outlines all key cut-off times and dates for the performance of salient electoral activities. The timetable contains crucial performance dates for election contestants as well as the broad voting public. As regards the voting public, the focal point is assessing the voting process through special arrangements, including dates for applications for special votes and notifications to vote outside a voting station of registration.
Welcome back, and we're talking about the election which is upon us as South Africans, and with the IEC and experts uncovering how ready we are for this very important election for our democracy. Commissioner Janet Love, who joins us from the IEC. The readiness for the election is, on the one hand, logistical, but there's also an element of educating citizens, especially for the differences in this election to past national elections. What's top of mind for you and the IEC now in terms of what citizens need to know going forward in this election?
Well, I think let's start with the issue of ensuring that we maximize participation in people being able to exercise the vote regardless of what their individual circumstances are. So the timetable does set dates for certain things that citizens need to know. For example, if somebody is not going to be able to vote at their voting station because they are at work or for some other unavoidable reason, we have in this election, as a result of a change in law, a system whereby people have to give us prior notice that that is going to be the case. And that prior notice is Section 24A, so no longer can people turn up at a voting station that is not their own voting station and say, I want to fill in a form. They have to give that prior notice. So there is a deadline for that prior notice, and that is a deadline that comes about on the 17th of May. We did extend that at the request of the political parties as far out as possible.
Right.
So that process can only commence for people to make those, to fill in the necessary, to give us the notice, can only commence after the voters' roll has been certified. So that already tells you that there's a very close relationship between the two things. The second thing is that there are people who maybe will not be able to vote on the 29th for various reasons, but particularly because maybe they're infirm and they need to have home visits,
right,
or because they are going to be on some kind of duty somewhere. So again, that special vote application process, the closing date is the 3rd of May, and those applications, you know, people go online and they can fill in those applications. There are some South Africans who may be traveling abroad, or people who are registered at voting stations abroad who may not be at the voting station where they're registered. They may, you know, travel to another country. Now, those processes we need to accommodate, and so those applications need to be made to us by the 22nd of April. It's what used to and still is known as filling in what's called a VEC or VIC-10 form. So those are dates that we want South Africans who are, so we maximize the opportunity for all South Africans to vote. That's one area of very great importance. A second area of importance, as I mentioned before, is to ensure that South Africans know who their candidates are going to be, so that they can go to those polls on an informed basis, knowing what it is, not just who it is and what the logo is, but actually knowing why they're going to be voting, so that they have a much greater sense of ownership. So that's something that, of course, relates to finalization of the candidate lists and so on. And then lastly, I think the third thing is there are going to be issues that require additional familiarization of the public, not just the principle of having 3 ballots, but that becomes more real once we have the design of those ballots. And again, that design is something that can't be finalized until there is certainty about who the candidates are.
Dr. Nyembezi, you know, we've talked about the perspective of the IEC and how ready they are and what they're thinking about. What about the duties of citizens in these next 3 months? What do you think citizens should be doing, and what are the responsibilities of citizens to make sure that their voices are heard and that they can participate in this right that over which so much blood, sweat and tears was spilled?
Yes, the first thing is to interact with the election manifestos, the election promises, and the individuals making those promises. There are so many times that people are asking, why don't we have this? Why are things not working here? And the opportunity now is to ask the candidates, the questions to those candidates, particularly those who are in power now, so that they can also account for the promises they made 5 years ago, 3 years ago, 30 years ago. The other thing is it relates to a time when the list of candidates has been announced by the IEC. Citizens must interrogate that list to see if there are no people who are not supposed to be there, people who are implicated in corruption, people who have criminal records, because we must know as citizens that there are statutory disqualifications that are there, and then there are moral and other political disqualifications. Starting with statutory disqualifications, people who have been convicted before without an option of a fine, convicted and imprisoned without an option to fine, people who've committed crimes that we disapprove of, particularly gender-based violence and other things. So once we see names that have question marks next to them, we must, as citizens, speak out to say to if they are members of political parties, why do you continue to put these people? Take them out. If they are independent candidates, to speak directly to them, say, no, you cannot stand. That process is very important because it will ensure that those who end up occupying those seats are people that we are happy with in terms of their moral duty, in terms of their ethical standing because we have a history in South Africa. And then the third thing is just to go out and vote early. Go wake up early in the morning and go and vote. You must not allow anything to distract you. Particularly, the commissioner has mentioned that if you know that you might not be able to vote on the 29th, you can request to vote on the 28th, on a special vote, or on the 27th, as the system allows. But you must vote and go out and vote in big numbers.
Absolutely. Commissioner Love, we've spoken about the build-up to the election and when citizens are in the voting booth. What about the counting and that process? Because with more ballots, I wonder whether that might mean more time for counting. And can you take us into the thinking in the Commission around that area of the election?
Certainly. I think that the Commission is aware that there is, first of all, going to be a requirement for more staffing and more management of the queues and so on to enable people who may be faced with a longer ballot to, and therefore that could delay the time that takes at certain in certain instances.
Sure.
So that's already going to add on pressure and contribute to fatigue, because as you can imagine, voting officials have been working the 27th, the 28th, the 29th, getting up as early as 4 in the morning and going right through. So as a result of that, the Commission is also going to be introducing additional staffing capacity to help with the counting process, and has also put in place additional capacity to be sure that the auditing process for the result slips that have already been finalized and signed at the voting station, once it gets to the local center for capturing, it's audited there independently, and that auditing process also has additional capacity. So those are two actions that we will be pursuing.
Are you expecting a longer than usual counting period?
We certainly do expect that there will be a longer counting period, just because there are 3 different ballots to count.
Yeah.
But also, I think, because we realize that the whole counting process is going to have the added possibility of being a longer ballot, therefore with more options. But I think those are things that we are in the process of training our officials for as we speak. There are training processes that are going on in all of the provinces, have been and are continuing. So we're hoping that that kind of capacity will be in place, yeah.
We're talking the freedom and fairness of South Africa's elections, which is intricately bound with the preparation for those elections and exactly what, as a voter, you can expect in this, in some ways, unprecedented election. When we come back, we'll delve into the true questions of freedom and fairness and the confidence we can have in our electoral process. Stick with us. Welcome back to Unfiltered. One of the things we pride ourselves on as a nation is having had free and fair elections regularly and in conformity with our constitution. And this evening we're discussing, of course, the all-important election which is coming up in just 3 months. And I'm joined by Commissioner Janet Love of the IEC, as well as Dr. Nyembezi, our elections expert. And, you know, freedom and fairness are these buzzwords that we throw around. How do you understand the freedom and fairness of an election in the South African context? And how should we be thinking about these things as informed citizens and defining them?
These are very important concepts to deal with because free and fairness of the election, the freeness has to do with the fact that no one who's not supposed to vote votes. That is why it is important to get that voters roll in order. And also it has to do with the fact that those who are supposed to contest, they are allowed to contest. No one is prevented from contesting. The freeness of it. Then the fairness of it is that it has to do with the announcement of all these regulations, how many signatures you need, what are the deadlines and the deposits, and also the counting of the votes. And the IEC has done a tremendous work throughout to ensure that. But now what is also a reality for South Africa that tends to militate against free and fair elections is this issue of political violence, electoral violence in different parts of the country. You know, the KwaZulu-Natal Christian Council, the Election Monitoring Network, and other structures I happen to work with, we are confronted with these issues. It's more pronounced in some provinces than in others, provinces like KwaZulu-Natal, where people are dying. But you've also seen the chaos in the city of Ekurhuleni this evening, where there's an issue of a vote of not confidence. And now when we look at the profile of a candidate that is going to contest in these elections, there are some local councillors who are looking to graduate from local government into provincial or national government. So if this issue of intolerance comes out inside and outside of the legislatures, it is a worrying thing. We will expect citizens to be vigilant so that there is no pulling down of posters. There is no prevention of members of one political or supporters of one political party from assembling and holding rallies. Those are the kind of things we are looking at. In overall, there must be compliance with the Electoral Code of Conduct.
You said something quite interesting in an article you penned last week, I think, or a few weeks ago, where you said something that I hadn't realized, which is that freedom and fairness is not just about those who participate in an election, but it's actually a right that every citizen has, you know, whether they can or can't or do or don't participate in the election. So it's actually a right that applies to the whole of the society, and that's something worth bearing in mind.
Yes, that was the pronouncement of the Constitutional Court in the number of court cases that we've had, particularly when we're dealing with the issue of independence with respect to what they must be, how they must be treated in contesting the harm judgment. So yes, all citizens are entitled to free and fair elections, even those who do not vote. And so there must be no one who can think they can hold us in ransom in pushing what they want and they demand, as if elections are just about one political party, about one sectoral group. We must work together, all of us as South Africans, to ensure the fulfillment of that right, knowing that it belongs to us all.
Commissioner Love, in that context, as we go towards the final process, we've dealt with the build-up, we've dealt with the voting stations and the counting. There will be an announcement and there will be some, well, more losers than ever in this election, let's put it that way. And that opens the door to, I recall in 2019, I think there was this kind of collection of parties that ran to the stage at the ROC, and then everyone sort of realized they didn't even amount to 1%, you know, collectively. But we do open the door if we're not careful, and I think this is where we may have to be in lockstep with the IEC as the media of the potential for opportunism and sore losers having an axe to grind when the counting and the results are announced.
I think that's true, and I think that the important thing for us is, even in advance of the results coming out, we need to just take a step to interrogate all the systems that are in place and the safeguards that the Electoral Commission puts in place to really insulate an election from manipulation that creates the kind of unfairness that is being spoken about. So, for example, the fact that our counting is done in the voting station in front of not just party agents, but also in front of observers. that it's done, and people must be allowed to do it with as much care, and sometimes that takes people to 2, 3 o'clock in the morning to do it. That's not just because people are trying to do it slowly, but people are trying to do it with the necessary precision. And so I think that that's one sort of set of safeguards, and we urge observers, our national observers, we urge political parties to make agents and observers available to see that process. And the important thing about that is that if before anybody says how many votes this person or that person got in that voting station, there's even a suggestion by anybody that something is being done wrongly, then it must be recorded and it must be dealt with, first of all by the counting officer, but otherwise that's something that must go in the diary. It must be, and the necessary evidence, the necessary, because eventually it will see itself into a court. You can't make wild allegations. If there is something wrong, we want to correct it because we want these elections to be fair, we want them to be free. So if there's something wrong, it needs to be documented, it needs to have the evidence, because it will then go to another process. But we hope that that doesn't happen, and it won't happen if people are educated about how those things work. And that's the party agents, that's the observers. We do a lot of training of local observers. We provide material as well as of our officials. There's also auditing of the process that happens. When the result slips are signed in the voting station, agents, party officials, the observers can all take photographs of the image of that. But those result slips are also photographed by electoral officials, and they go onto a system that is available not just to the Electoral Commission, but to political parties themselves to interrogate. And political parties that are that have made it their business to know the system have done so, and we've responded. So again, we've got to do this in lockstep with all of the role players in an electoral process, because everybody's got to make it a success. We put in place the systems to enable that. We put in place the independent monitors, observers, and auditors to be able to reinforce it, so that when the results are made and announced, people who come forward would really have to be able to demonstrate how none of that was in place. And so we're appealing to all of the stakeholders, including, we know there's a lot of understanding of the media of how that works, but for each election, we want the media to know, so that that robustness is something that sees us through the disappointment, and as you've said, even some of the sort of opportunism and chaotic activity that losers want to bring about. But it's going to be something that they will discredit themselves if we all understand the system.
Dr. Nyembezi, anything you'd like to react to there in terms of how tight our electoral counting systems are, and any final thoughts that you have? We are running out of time, so just your final thoughts in a minute or so.
Yes, the counting system and the processes inside the voting station and inside the parameter of a voting station have always been well managed by the IEC officials in the presence of party agents and election observers. And we hope it will remain the case, particularly because the number of voting stations has been increased. So we hope that each station will be able to contain the expected voters there, so that people can vote and finish on time. The appeal now can go to election candidates that they must not use inflammatory statements. They must not violate the electoral conduct. Right. They must not rubbish the work that has been done
in a way that can militate against free and fair elections.
Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Nyembezi and Commissioner Janet Love. We really appreciate your time this evening for enlightening us on the election. Let's take a look at some of the comments that have come through on social media. I believe there has been some conversation over there. Let's take Roses Are Red, who says, what happens if you are registered in the Western Cape but had to move home to Gauteng through unseen circumstances? Can one's new address be registered before the 17th of May? Another comment coming through. Definitely, as beacon of democracy on the continent, we will have to lead by example. So yes, our elections will be free and fair. And a final comment, I believe that's the last comment, and we are running out of time, but let's continue this conversation on social media. And thank you very much for joining us for this fascinating conversation on the readiness for South Africa's elections, their freedom and their fairness. Stay tuned for more installments of Unfiltered News, Unfiltered Views, and Unfiltered Conversations. Have a good night.